Hadji Diouf ran a cocaine operation that moved multi-ton shipments from West Africa into American cities. His network didn't rely on street violence or territorial control. Instead, it functioned like a logistics company, using container ports, maritime geography, and institutional corruption to quietly displace traditional crime syndicates in U.S. wholesale markets. By the time federal authorities understood the scale of the operation, West Africa had already become a central hub in the global cocaine trade, with traffickers moving an estimated 46 metric tons through the region during peak years between 2005 and 2008. The question isn't how one man built an empire. It's how an entire supply chain was modernized without anyone noticing until it was too late. The transformation happened gradually, across borders and oceans, involving hundreds of participants who never met each other but whose coordinated actions reshaped the geography of global drug trafficking. Understanding this operation requires looking beyond individual criminals to examine the systems they exploited and the institutions they corrupted. At the beginning of the 21st century, the global cocaine trade underwent a fundamental restructuring that would reshape trafficking patterns for the next 2 decades. For years, South American cartels had relied on direct maritime routes through the Caribbean or overland corridors along the US-Mexico border to move product from the Andean production zones to North American markets. These routes were known, mapped, and increasingly interdicted by U.S. Coast Guard operations and DEA surveillance networks operating with sophisticated radar systems, satellite tracking, and intelligence-sharing protocols developed over decades of counter-narcotics work. Seizure rates climbed steadily through the 1990s and early 2000s. Transit costs increased as traffickers lost shipments to enforcement actions. The risk-to-reward calculus that had made Caribbean routes profitable began to shift unfavorably for the cartels. Traditional smuggling corridors became increasingly dangerous and expensive to operate. West Africa emerged as the solution to this enforcement pressure. The region offered porous maritime borders stretching thousands of kilometers, expanding port infrastructure marketed as gateways to economic development and global trade integration, and governance systems weakened by decades of civil conflict, structural adjustment programs, and chronic underfunding of security apparatus. Traffickers didn't create these vulnerabilities through their own actions. They identified them through careful reconnaissance and built a logistical model specifically designed to exploit them. The genius of the West African route was that it turned the region's underdevelopment into a strategic asset rather than a liability. The shift wasn't driven by a single cartel or organization making a unilateral decision. It was a tripartite alliance involving Latin American suppliers who controlled the product and had established relationships with coca farmers in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, Balkan criminal groups who managed technical coordination and brought expertise from decades of smuggling operations in Europe, and West African intermediaries, who provided ground-level facilitation based on intimate knowledge of local power structures, maritime geography, and the practical mechanics of moving cargo through African ports. Each faction filled a specific niche in the supply chain, and the division of labor created operational efficiency that no single organization could have achieved alone. The Latin Americans managed production and the initial ocean crossing, applying lessons learned from years of maritime smuggling. The Sinaloa cartel and Brazil's Primeiro Comando de Capital established the initial Atlantic crossing, using modified fishing vessels and commercial freighters to move cocaine from South American ports to African waters. Their strategy was to minimize their own exposure by handing off responsibility once the product reached African territorial waters or anchored in international waters off the African coast. They didn't need to understand West African politics, local customs procedures, or the intricacies of port operations in Dakar or Lagos. They just needed reliable partners who could take delivery and manage the next phase of the journey. Montenegrin and Albanian networks took over the technical logistics, particularly after 2019 when their presence became firmly entrenched in coastal West African states. These groups brought sophisticated knowledge of container manipulation, customs evasion techniques refined through years of smuggling cigarettes and weapons into Europe, and maritime coordination skills that made them indispensable to the supply chain. They acted as the operational bridge between South American production and European or North American wholesale markets, managing the complex middle segment of the journey that required the most technical expertise. Their involvement marked a professionalization of the trade, moving it away from the improvised methods of earlier decades toward a more systematic, business-oriented approach. West African actors like Diouf handled the final piece that made the entire operation viable: safe harbor, secure storage facilities, institutional protection through systematic bribery, and repackaging for onward shipment to the United States and Europe. They understood local power structures in ways that outsiders never could, knew which officials could be bribed and at what price points, had the geographic knowledge to identify secure landing sites along thousands of kilometers of coastline, and maintained the social connections necessary to operate warehouses and front companies without attracting unwanted attention from local law enforcement or community oversight. They functioned as logistics firms offering specialized services, warehousing, concealment, institutional protection, that allowed the drugs to move through official channels disguised as legitimate commerce. This wasn't a traditional criminal hierarchy with a godfather figure issuing commands from the top of a pyramid structure. It was a business partnership optimized for efficiency and risk distribution, with each party maintaining operational independence while coordinating on shared objectives. The Latin Americans minimized their exposure by offloading risk once the product reached Africa, thereby avoiding entanglement with unfamiliar legal systems and enforcement agencies. The Balkans provided operational expertise in the technical aspects of smuggling that required specialized knowledge, such as how to manipulate shipping manifests, how to construct hidden compartments in containers that could survive inspection, and how to coordinate timing across multiple jurisdictions. The West Africans leveraged their understanding of local systems to move the drugs through the most vulnerable point in the supply chain, the ports and customs facilities where enforcement should theoretically be strongest, but where institutional weakness created opportunities that traffickers systematically exploited. West Africa's geography made it ideal for this kind of operation in ways that few other regions could match. The coastline stretches thousands of kilometers from Mauritania in the north through Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria in the south. Much of it remote, underpopulated, and nearly impossible to patrol effectively with the limited resources available to regional governments. Offshore islands and river deltas provide natural concealment, with hundreds of small inlets, estuaries, and coastal features that allow vessels to approach land without being observed by coastal surveillance systems. The fishing industry, which employs millions of people across the region, provides cover for suspicious maritime activity. A boat anchored offshore could be engaged in fishing, conducting transfers between vessels or waiting for darkness to make a landing. And distinguishing between these activities requires resources that most West African maritime authorities simply don't possess. Major commercial ports like Dakar in Senegal and Lagos in Nigeria were undergoing rapid expansion during the same period that cocaine trafficking through the region intensified. These ports were being upgraded to accommodate increased global trade, with new container terminals, expanded warehousing facilities, and deeper channels to handle larger vessels. The goal was to position West Africa as an emerging hub in global supply chains, attracting foreign investment and generating economic growth through increased trade volumes. But security protocols lagged significantly behind capacity growth, creating a gap between the volume of cargo moving through these facilities and the ability of authorities to effectively monitor it. Traffickers identified this gap and exploited it systematically. The expansion that was supposed to bring prosperity also created the infrastructure that made large-scale cocaine smuggling possible. The Atlantic crossing began with large commercial vessels, often fishing boats modified for narcotics storage, but sometimes legitimate cargo ships whose crews had been bribed or coerced into cooperation. These vessels departed from ports in Brazil, Venezuela, or Argentina, carrying cocaine produced in Colombia, Peru, or Bolivia that had been transported overland or by river to Atlantic coastal areas. The journey across the ocean could take weeks, with the vessels maintaining radio silence to avoid detection and following routes designed to minimize the probability of interdiction by international naval patrols. These mother ships would anchor in international waters off the West African coast, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from land, in areas where no country's territorial jurisdiction applied and where enforcement resources were virtually non-existent. At this point, sitting in international waters beyond the reach of any single country's legal authority, the cocaine would be transferred to smaller, more nimble boats capable of navigating shallow coastal waters and approaching shore without being detected by radar systems or visual observation from coastal stations. This transfer process, conducted on the open ocean often at night or in adverse weather conditions that provided additional concealment, reduced the risk of a single massive seizure at a port that would destroy the entire shipment and expose the network. It also allowed for flexible landing sites. If one location was compromised or under surveillance, the smaller vessels could divert to alternative beaches or inlets along the coast. The traffickers invested in high-speed boats capable of outrunning the patrol vessels available to West African coast guards, many of which lacked fuel, functioning engines, or the speed necessary to pursue suspected smugglers effectively. Locations like Nianing, a secluded town on Senegal's southern coast between Dakar and the Gambian border, became preferred landing zones based on specific geographic and social factors. The local geography featured beaches accessible from the ocean, but difficult to observe from roads or populated areas, natural features that provided concealment from aerial observation, and a local economy based on fishing that made maritime activity appear routine rather than suspicious. Community knowledge accumulated over generations of fishing and smuggling smaller-scale contraband made local residents valuable as guides and facilitators. The social fabric of coastal communities, often marginalized from national political structures and economically dependent on the sea, created conditions where cooperation with traffickers could be secured through payments that exceeded annual incomes from legitimate fishing. In March 2009, a large haul of cocaine was seized in one of these canoes near Dakar, exposing the maritime transfer tactics that had been operating quietly for years and providing authorities with a clear picture of how the landing operations function mechanically. Once ashore, the cocaine moved to major urban centers through road networks that connected coastal areas to capital cities and commercial hubs. Dakar's port, a central node in West Africa's integration into the global economy and one of the largest container facilities between North Africa and South Africa, became a critical repackaging site where the real innovation of the network became apparent. Traffickers used a technique called in-region containerization that represented a fundamental evolution from traditional smuggling methods. Instead of shipping cocaine directly from South America to the United States in one container, a method that carried high risk if the shipment was flagged for inspection, they would offload it in West Africa, store it in warehouses near the port that were either owned by shell companies or operated with the knowledge and protection of bribed officials, and then repack it into legitimate commercial containers bound for international cities. These containers were filled with standard regional exports, charcoal, timber, agricultural products like peanuts or cashews, that moved in high volume and wouldn't raise suspicion at customs checkpoints in New York, Baltimore, or European ports. Lagos played a similar role, but at an even larger scale given Nigeria's position as West Africa's most populous country and largest economy. Nigeria's Tin Can Port Terminal and the larger Apapa Port Complex handled massive volumes of legitimate trade daily, with thousands of containers moving through the facilities in a constant flow of imports and exports. Traffickers inserted their cargo into this flow, exploiting the simple reality that comprehensive inspection of every container was logistically impossible without paralyzing commercial operations. A recent seizure of 1 ton of cocaine at Tin Can Port revealed how they used empties, containers that had been imported full of goods and were being returned empty for re-export to conceal drugs. The empty containers, which customs officials might assume contained nothing of value, actually carried cocaine that would be unpacked once the container reached its final destination. The scale of legal commerce moving through these ports made it nearly impossible for understaffed customs officials, working with outdated inspection equipment and inadequate training, to identify the relatively small percentage of containers that carried contraband rather than legitimate cargo. Guinea-Bissau represented the extreme end of the spectrum of state vulnerability to trafficking networks. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported that at times during the mid-2000s, the value of cocaine trafficked through the country exceeded its entire national GDP, creating an economic situation where the illicit trade was literally more valuable than the entire legitimate economy combined. This wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. It was a mathematical reality based on seizure data, estimated trafficking volumes, and the known wholesale price of cocaine in consumer markets. The country's porous coastline, coupled with severe institutional weakness resulting from decades of political instability, military coups, and chronic underdevelopment, made it what analysts began calling a narco-state prototype, a country where criminal networks had achieved such deep penetration of government structures that distinguishing between state authority and criminal organization became meaningless. Offshore islands like the Bajagos Archipelago, a chain of dozens of islands stretching along the coast with minimal government presence and virtually no law enforcement capacity, became storage hubs where multi-ton quantities of cocaine could be warehoused for weeks or months while traffickers arranged onward transportation. State officials, from local police to cabinet ministers, were systematically bribed or threatened into cooperation, creating an environment where traffickers could operate with near-total impunity. The line between governance and criminal enterprise didn't just blur, it disappeared entirely. The economic disparity between narco capital and legitimate state revenue created an environment where corruption wasn't just opportunistic. It was structural, systematic, and in many ways rational from the perspective of individual officials facing the choice between modest legal salaries and transformative illegal payments. In Senegal, remittances from the diaspora contributed nearly a third of the national budget in 2004, totaling approximately $618 million sent home by Senegalese workers in Europe, North America, and other parts of Africa. This informal financial system, built on networks of trust between family members and community connections maintained across generations, moved money through channels that were largely untraceable by financial intelligence units. It relied on informal transfer systems, where money deposited in Paris or New York would be made available to recipients in Dakar without any formal banking records of the international transfer. This system, while serving legitimate purposes for millions of families, also provided a convenient veil for laundering narcotics proceeds, allowing traffickers to move drug profits into the formal economy by disguising them as remittances from relatives working abroad. The same channels used by families to send money home for school fees, medical expenses, or small business investments were co-opted by criminal networks to integrate millions of dollars in cocaine profits into Senegal's economy without triggering the regulatory scrutiny that formal banking transfers would have attracted. The profit margins at every stage of the supply chain incentivized participation from actors who might otherwise have remained in the legitimate economy. Transport alone, the service of moving cocaine from one location to another without adding any value through processing or refinement, could increase the product's price by up to 290% according to research on South American trafficking economics. For intermediaries like Diouf, managing the middle mile of distribution between South America and the United States offered returns that dwarfed any legitimate business opportunity available in the region. A single successful multi-ton shipment could generate millions of dollars in revenue, more than a legitimate import-export business might earn in a decade of operations. This economic reality created powerful incentives for individuals with business skills, maritime knowledge, or institutional connections to enter the trafficking business despite the legal risks involved. Local officials faced a calculation that had less to do with individual morality than with economic rationality. Police and customs officers earned salaries that barely covered basic expenses: housing, food, transportation, school fees for children. In many cases, these salaries went unpaid for months due to government budget shortfalls, forcing officials to find alternative income sources just to survive. Traffickers, by contrast, had access to seemingly unlimited funds and could offer bribes that exceeded years of official income in a single transaction. A customs inspector earning perhaps $300 per month might be offered $10,000 to ensure that a specific container bypassed inspection protocols, a sum equivalent to nearly 3 years of salary for a few minutes of looking the other way. The lack of basic resources compounded this economic pressure. Security forces lacked telephones for communicating between posts, computers for accessing databases or tracking cargo, electricity to power equipment even when it existed, and fuel for patrol cars and boats that sat idle while traffickers moved shipments through areas that should have been under surveillance. Traffickers, meanwhile, operated with satellite phones allowing real-time coordination across continents, GPS systems for navigation and tracking, high-speed boats that could outrun anything the Coast Guard possessed, and expensive vehicles that projected power and success. This wasn't primarily a question of individual moral failure by specific corrupt officials, though such failures certainly occurred. It was a systemic problem rooted in the fundamental underfunding of government institutions and the enormous wealth disparity between criminal organizations and the state apparatus meant to combat them. Financial intelligence units didn't exist in many of these countries, meaning there was no institutional capacity to track suspicious financial transactions, identify money laundering patterns, or investigate the flow of narco-capital through the economy. Anti-corruption agencies, where they existed at all, lacked enforcement power, political independence, or the resources necessary to investigate complex financial crimes involving international networks and offshore accounts. Prison facilities were inadequate, overcrowded, and in some cases so poorly secured that inmates could continue running criminal enterprises from inside, meaning that even when arrests occurred, successful prosecutions remained unlikely, and imprisonment didn't necessarily disrupt operations. Courts lacked judges trained in financial crimes, prosecutors with the expertise to build complex cases against international trafficking networks, and the legal frameworks necessary to seize assets or prosecute money laundering. Traffickers maintained long-term operations not because West African officials were uniquely corrupt compared to officials elsewhere, but because the legal and institutional systems meant to disrupt them were in a state of collapse or had never been adequately developed in the first place. The concept of state capture describes a process where criminal networks infiltrate government structures to the point where they can operate with near-total impunity, not by overthrowing the state, but by making themselves indispensable to its functioning. Unlike street gangs that fight against the state through violence and confrontation, logistical trafficking networks swallow the state from within through systematic corruption, strategic bribery, and the exploitation of institutional weaknesses. This was the model West African traffickers perfected, learning from the failures of more violent drug trafficking organizations in Latin America and applying those lessons to create a quieter, more sustainable approach to criminal enterprise. Bribery wasn't occasional or transactional, a payment here and there to solve immediate problems. It was systematic and institutional, woven into the regular operations of ports, customs facilities, and government ministries. Customs officials received regular payments, sometimes structured like salaries, to ensure they looked the other way when specific containers moved through their inspection zones. These weren't one-time bribes but ongoing relationships that created mutual dependency. The official relied on the regular payments to maintain a standard of living above what the government salary provided, while the traffickers relied on the official's cooperation to move shipments without disruption. Port Authority managers were paid to ensure certain shipments bypassed inspection protocols entirely, either by manipulating the computerized systems that flagged containers for inspection or by physically directing containers away from areas where inspections occurred. Local police were either bribed into inaction through regular payments or threatened with violence if they interfered with operations, creating a climate where officers learned that cooperation was safer and more profitable than enforcement. In some cases, high-ranking government officials directly facilitated operations, providing legal cover through their positions in ministries that oversaw ports and customs, advance warning of enforcement actions planned by international partners, and political protection that made it difficult or dangerous for lower-level officials to pursue investigations. The lack of violence in this model was a tactical choice rather than a moral preference. Traditional cartels in Mexico and Colombia relied on territorial control enforced through street-level violence, assassinations of rivals, attacks on police, public displays of power designed to intimidate communities and authorities. This approach inevitably drew intense law enforcement attention, militarized responses from governments, and international cooperation to combat the organizations. It also destabilized the very territories the cartels sought to control, making business operations more difficult and unpredictable. West African networks studied these failures and chose a different path. They prioritized operational security over dominance displays, understanding that quiet infiltration allowed them to operate for longer periods without triggering the same level of international scrutiny. Violence was used selectively and strategically rather than routinely, typically reserved for situations where someone threatened to expose the network, or where an example needed to be made to maintain discipline within the organization. This restraint made the networks harder to detect, harder to prosecute, and harder to justify the kind of militarized enforcement responses that governments applied to more violent organizations. Guinea-Bissau illustrated this dynamic in its most extreme form, becoming a case study that researchers and policymakers reference when discussing state capture. The country's governance structures were so comprehensively compromised that analysts stopped describing it as a state experiencing criminal infiltration and started calling it a state captured by criminal interests, a distinction that marked a qualitative shift in the relationship between government and organized crime. High-level officials, including military leaders who had come to power through coups, ministers responsible for national security, and judges who should have been prosecuting traffickers, didn't just tolerate the cocaine trade. They participated in it directly, either as investors in trafficking operations, as providers of protection services, or as facilitators who smoothed operations in exchange for percentages of profits. The economic power of narco-capital exceeded the government's own budget, meaning that any attempt to challenge trafficking operations could be overwhelmed through sheer financial force. Traffickers could outbid the government for the loyalty of soldiers, police officers, and government employees, creating a situation where the state lacked the capacity to enforce its own laws. Legal systems that might have prosecuted traffickers were hollowed out, either through direct corruption of judges and prosecutors or through deliberate defunding that left courts unable to function effectively. In some cases, prosecutors who attempted to pursue cases against trafficking networks found their investigations blocked by superior officers who had been bribed. In others, they simply lacked the resources, offices, computers, legal databases, investigators necessary to build cases against sophisticated international criminal organizations. Defense attorneys, often paid by trafficking networks, could exploit procedural technicalities that undermined prosecutions. Witnesses who might have provided testimony were either bribed into silence, threatened with violence, or simply disappeared. The result was a legal system that existed formally but couldn't function in practice, creating the appearance of rule of law while allowing impunity to reign. The offshore islands of Guinea-Bissau became de facto criminal zones where government authority barely existed even in theory. The Bijagos archipelago, consisting of dozens of islands scattered along the coast with a combined population of perhaps 30,000 people, had minimal government presence beyond a few scattered police posts that lacked boats to patrol between islands. Maritime patrol capacity was essentially non-existent. The National Coast Guard, if it could be called that, consisted of a handful of small boats that frequently lacked fuel to operate. These islands served as storage and transshipment hubs where cocaine could be warehoused for extended periods while traffickers arranged onward transportation. The cocaine moved through them with the same ease as legitimate commercial goods, stored in warehouses or buried on beaches, guarded by armed men whose presence local residents learned not to question. The local population became economically dependent on the trade, with trafficking organizations providing employment, infrastructure investments, and social services that the government couldn't or wouldn't provide, creating community-level resistance to any enforcement efforts that threatened this flow of resources. The success of the West African route depended on sophisticated cooperation between three distinct criminal ecosystems, each bringing specialized expertise that the others lacked, and each maintaining operational independence while coordinating on shared objectives. This structure created resilience. If one faction was disrupted, the others could continue operating and eventually find replacement partners. Latin American suppliers, primarily the Sinaloa cartel operating out of Mexico and northwestern South America, and Brazil's Primeiro Comando de Capital operating from São Paulo and Brazilian port cities, controlled cocaine production in the Andean regions through relationships with coca farmers and processing laboratories. The Sinaloa cartel had been a pioneer in expanding into Africa, establishing a presence in Nigeria, Ghana, Mali, and Senegal as early as the mid-2000s, when Caribbean routes were becoming too risky. Their strategy focused on vertical integration of the supply chain only up to the point where it remained cost-effective. They controlled production, domestic distribution in Latin America, and the initial ocean crossing, but they deliberately avoided trying to manage operations in regions where they lacked local knowledge and institutional connections. They managed the initial Atlantic crossing using their considerable resources and maritime expertise developed over decades of smuggling, using modified fishing vessels capable of carrying multiple tons of cocaine and commercial freighters whose crews had been bribed into cooperation. These vessels followed routes designed to minimize interception probability, staying in international waters for most of the journey and maintaining radio silence to avoid detection by signals intelligence operated by the United States and European countries. Their goal was to get the cocaine to African waters and then hand off responsibility to partners better positioned to manage the next phase. They didn't need to understand the intricacies of West African politics, the specific customs procedures at the port of Dakar, or the local power dynamics in Senegalese fishing communities. They just needed reliable partners who could take delivery of multi-ton shipments and ensure those shipments continued moving toward final consumer markets. Balkan criminal groups, particularly Montenegrin clans like Kavach and Skaljari who had emerged from the violent conflicts of the 1990s, and various Albanian-speaking networks operating across the former Yugoslavia and into Western Europe, brought a different set of skills developed through decades of cigarette smuggling, weapons trafficking, and human smuggling operations. Since 2019, these organizations had firmly entrenched themselves in West African coastal states, not just visiting for individual operations, but establishing permanent presences with local representatives, rented facilities, and ongoing relationships with officials and fixers. They took over the technical logistics of the operation, acting as middle management in the supply chain. Their expertise included container manipulation, knowing how to construct hidden compartments that could survive inspection, understanding how to manipulate shipping manifests and documentation to make suspicious shipments appear routine, and having the technical knowledge to coordinate complex multi-leg journeys involving transfers between vessels and routing through multiple jurisdictions. They understood European and North American port security systems from years of smuggling into those markets, knowledge that helped them identify the points of maximum vulnerability where contraband was most likely to pass undetected. Their role bridged the gap between South American production capacity and European or North American wholesale distribution networks, providing the technical coordination that made the entire operation possible. They were less interested in controlling territory or building long-term criminal empires than in maintaining profitable business operations, which made them effective partners who could work with multiple organizations simultaneously without triggering the kind of violent competition that destabilized other trafficking routes. West African intermediaries like Diouf provided the essential ground-level infrastructure that made the entire operation viable in practical terms. They leveraged their understanding of local power structures, knowing which chiefs held authority in coastal communities, which government ministers controlled relevant agencies, which military officers might protect or threaten operations, to provide safe harbor for incoming shipments. Their knowledge of maritime geography, accumulated over lifetimes spent in coastal regions, allowed them to identify landing sites that combined accessibility from the ocean with concealment from authorities and local populations. They understood customs procedures not from studying regulations, but from years of navigating these systems for legitimate import-export businesses or previous smuggling operations involving different commodities. This practical knowledge of how ports actually functioned, as opposed to how they were supposed to function according to official procedures, was invaluable for identifying the gaps between rules and reality that could be exploited. They provided storage facilities, either through ownership of warehouses under shell company names or through relationships with warehouse operators who could be trusted or coerced into providing space. They managed the institutional protection necessary for the operation to function, maintaining the systematic bribery networks that kept officials cooperative and handling the occasional enforcement problems that arose when an honest officer or an officer from outside the network stumbled across evidence of the operation. They didn't seek territorial control in the way traditional gangs did, with defined areas where they enforced monopolies through violence. Instead, they functioned as logistics firms providing specialized services to clients, services that happened to be illegal, but that followed the same business principles as legitimate logistics companies. This division of labor created a level of operational efficiency that no single organization could have achieved alone. The Latin Americans brought product and maritime capability. The Balkans brought technical expertise in concealment and European market connections. The West Africans brought local knowledge and institutional access. Each faction maintained independence. They weren't employees of a single criminal enterprise, but independent contractors coordinating on shared projects. This structure also created resilience against enforcement. Removing one coordinator didn't collapse the entire network because others could step in to fill the role. Disrupting operations in one country didn't eliminate the model because it could be replicated in neighboring countries with similar vulnerabilities. The knowledge of how to run the operation, the technical details of container manipulation, the process of identifying corruptible officials, the mechanics of maritime transfers, persisted even when specific individuals were arrested or killed. The innovation that made the West African route so effective from a security perspective and so difficult for authorities to detect and disrupt was the in-region containerization technique. Traditional smuggling methods relied on concealing drugs at the point of origin, typically in South America, and hoping they would pass inspection at the destination port in the United States or Europe. This approach had serious vulnerabilities. Enforcement agencies knew that cocaine came from South America, so shipments originating from Colombian, Venezuelan, or Brazilian ports received heightened scrutiny. Drug-sniffing dogs, X-ray equipment, and physical inspections focused disproportionately on containers from these regions. As detection technology improved through the 1990s and 2000s, this direct shipping method became increasingly risky. The in-region model moved the critical concealment process to an intermediate location, fundamentally changing the risk calculus and making detection significantly harder through several mechanisms. The process worked in carefully planned stages, each designed to add layers of legitimacy to the shipment while obscuring its origins and true contents. The first stage was storage. Once cocaine reached West African shores through the maritime transfer process, it was moved to warehouses near major ports like Dakar or Lagos. These facilities were carefully selected or purpose-built to serve trafficking functions while maintaining appearances of legitimate business operations. Some warehouses were owned through shell companies registered in offshore jurisdictions with opaque ownership structures. A container shipping company registered in Panama might own a warehouse in Senegal, with the actual beneficial owners hidden behind layers of corporate structures designed specifically to prevent investigators from identifying who controlled the facility. Other warehouses were operated by seemingly legitimate businesses whose owners had been recruited into the network through bribes or threats. A warehouse that primarily handled legitimate agricultural exports might dedicate one section to cocaine storage, with employees either unaware of the illegal activity or paid to maintain silence. The warehouses needed certain characteristics: sufficient security to prevent theft, locations close enough to ports for efficient transfer, but far enough to avoid the concentration of law enforcement resources around port facilities, and enough legitimate business activity to justify the presence of trucks and workers moving cargo in and out. The drugs would sit in these facilities for periods ranging from days to months, while traffickers arranged the next phase of the operation. This storage period served multiple purposes beyond simply holding the cocaine until transportation could be arranged. It allowed traffickers to break up large shipments that had arrived on mother ships into smaller units that could be distributed to different markets or sent through different routes, reducing the risk that a single seizure would result in the loss of an entire consignment. It provided time for intelligence gathering. Traffickers could monitor enforcement activities at target ports, track which containers were being selected for inspection, and adjust their shipping plans based on current enforcement patterns. It allowed for market timing. If prices were low or enforcement was particularly intense in North American markets, traffickers could hold cocaine in storage until conditions improved rather than being forced to move it immediately. In some cases, the cocaine underwent processing during this storage period. The drug might be refined further to increase purity, allowing traffickers to add value and command higher prices in consumer markets. It might be adulterated or cut with other substances to increase volume and maximize profits, though this was less common for wholesale shipments where buyers expected high purity. The cocaine might be repackaged from the large bricks or packages in which it arrived into smaller units more suitable for concealment in specific types of cargo. This processing wasn't always necessary, but it provided an additional layer of profit opportunity and allowed traffickers to tailor the product to specific market demands or concealment methods. The critical step was the packout, the process of concealing the cocaine within legitimate export cargo in ways that would survive inspection if the container was selected for examination at the destination port. This required sophisticated understanding of both the legitimate export commodity and the inspection techniques likely to be used. Cocaine would be hidden within shipments of commodities that were standard exports from West Africa, carefully chosen to match the economic profile of the region and avoid raising suspicions. Charcoal shipments were particularly useful because charcoal's density and irregular shape made it difficult to scan with X-ray equipment. The cocaine could be molded into shapes resembling charcoal pieces or hidden in plastic bags within the charcoal. And unless inspectors physically emptied out the entire container and examined each piece, they wouldn't detect the contraband. Timber exports provided opportunities for concealing cocaine within hollowed-out logs or boards, with the drugs inserted into cavities and the openings sealed in ways that required destructive testing to discover. Agricultural products like peanuts, cashews, or cocoa beans, all major West African exports, could be mixed with cocaine packaged in similar containers or colors, making visual inspection insufficient to detect the drugs. The concealment techniques grew increasingly sophisticated as traffickers learned from seizures and adapted to enforcement methods. Simple hiding places, cocaine taped to the inside of containers or placed in obvious void spaces, gave way to more elaborate methods. Traffickers constructed hidden compartments with double walls and container interiors, requiring precise measurements and welding to create spaces that weren't visible on inspection and didn't show up obviously on X-ray scans. They used legitimate cargo to build concealment structures, for example, stacking bags of legitimate agricultural products to create a wall with a hidden space behind it where cocaine could be stored. They experimented with different materials for packaging the cocaine itself, looking for combinations of plastics, foil, and other materials that would minimize the distinctive signatures that drug-sniffing dogs could detect while still protecting the product from moisture and physical damage during shipping. Multiple transit countries were deliberately used to obscure the trail and make it nearly impossible for investigators to trace the shipment back to its origins. A container might be loaded in Dakar with an official manifest stating it contained charcoal destined for a commercial buyer in Europe. The container would be shipped to Lagos, where it would sit in the port for a week or more, officially waiting for a connecting vessel but actually creating a paper trail that made the shipment appear to originate from Nigeria rather than Senegal. In Lagos, the container might be briefly opened and resealed, either to inspect the concealment or to add additional cocaine from a different source, further complicating any investigation. From Lagos, the container would be loaded onto a vessel bound for a European port, perhaps Rotterdam or Antwerp, major transshipment hubs where millions of containers move annually. In Rotterdam, the container would go through the European port system, potentially being transferred again to another vessel, further obscuring its origin. Finally, it would be loaded onto a vessel bound for the United States, New York, Baltimore, Miami, or Houston. By the time the container reached American soil, it had touched multiple countries, been handled by different shipping companies at each leg, and accumulated paperwork that made it appear to be a routine European export rather than a South American drug shipment routed through Africa. Each transfer made it harder for enforcement authorities to trace the shipment's true origin. Customs officials in the United States looking at the container's documentation would see that it came from Rotterdam on a European shipping line, manifested as goods from a European exporter. Unless they had specific intelligence linking that particular container to drug trafficking, they had no obvious reason to suspect it carried cocaine from South America. Even if the container was inspected and cocaine was discovered, tracing it back to identify the individuals responsible became an enormous challenge. Which link in the chain was responsible? The shipper in Dakar, the handler in Lagos, the transshipment agent in Rotterdam, the importer in the United States. Each of these entities might be a legitimate business unknowingly handling a compromised container, or a shell company that would dissolve before investigators could determine ownership, or a real company whose employees had been bribed. Unraveling these chains required international cooperation, access to shipping records across multiple jurisdictions, and resources that investigations often lacked. This technique exploited a fundamental structural weakness in international trade security that persists despite decades of attempts to address it. The volume of containerized cargo moving through global ports is so massive, millions of containers annually through major hubs, that comprehensive physical inspection of every shipment is logistically impossible without bringing global trade to a halt. A single large container ship might carry 10,000 or more containers. Physically inspecting each one, opening it, examining the contents, rescaling it, would take weeks and require resources that no port possesses. Customs officials rely instead on risk profiling based on intelligence, algorithms that flag suspicious shipments based on factors like origin country, shipper history, commodity type, and destination. They conduct targeted inspections of containers that fit certain risk profiles and random inspections of a small percentage of other containers to create deterrence. But they're making educated guesses about which tiny fraction of total shipments might contain contraband. By making their shipments look exactly like the thousands of legitimate containers moving through the same routes, proper documentation, plausible commodity types, routing that made commercial sense, traffickers ensured that their containers blended into the background of normal trade. Unless enforcement agencies had specific intelligence about a particular shipment from an informant or intercepted communication, the containers were effectively invisible, protected by the sheer volume of legitimate commerce moving through the same channels. The cocaine was hidden in plain sight, moved through official channels, and delivered to destination markets using the same infrastructure as ordinary commercial goods. Hadji Diouf operated within this elaborate system not as its architect. No single individual created this model, but as a skilled facilitator and coordinator who understood how to make the system work efficiently. His role wasn't to manufacture cocaine in South American laboratories or to distribute it on American streets through retail networks. He managed the middle segment of the supply chain, the part that connected South American production to U.S. wholesale markets through West African logistics infrastructure, serving as the bridge between different criminal ecosystems that couldn't effectively communicate directly. Diouf's operation leveraged Senegal's specific advantages within the broader West African region, a relatively stable governance environment compared to neighbors experiencing civil wars or repeated military coups, but also sufficient institutional weakness and corruption to allow large-scale criminal operations to function without constant interference. Senegal offered commercial port infrastructure that could handle containerized cargo and had regular shipping connections to European and North American ports. It had international banking connections that allowed money to move through formal financial channels, albeit with minimal regulatory oversight. The country's large diaspora created legitimate flows of remittances that could be used to disguise drug proceeds. Guinea-Bissau, meanwhile, provided the operational flexibility and total institutional collapse that allowed for activities impossible in Senegal, using offshore islands as long-term storage facilities, conducting large-scale maritime transfers in coastal waters without any risk of interdiction, and operating with essentially zero law enforcement interference. The network Diouf built or participated in accounts vary on whether he was a primary organizer or a key lieutenant in a larger organization, functioned through relationships rather than through formal hierarchical structures with defined ranks and titles. It operated through institutional corruption rather than through street-level violence and territorial control. It relied on logistical expertise and problem-solving ability rather than on intimidation and fear. Diouf understood, whether through experience in legitimate import-export business that taught him how ports functioned or through gradual involvement in trafficking that provided on-the-job training, how to move cocaine from motherships anchored hundreds of kilometers offshore to secure warehouse facilities in or near Dakar. He knew the physical mechanics, which types of vessels could make the journey, how to coordinate timing so that transfers happened quickly and at times when surveillance was least likely, how to move multi-ton quantities of drugs from boats to trucks to warehouses without attracting attention from port workers, police, or community members who might report suspicious activity. He knew which customs officials would accept bribes and how much needed to be paid, Too little, and the official might feel insulted or insufficiently incentivized to take risks. Too much, and it might attract attention from superiors who would wonder about the sudden wealth. He understood which port managers could be trusted to ensure certain containers bypassed inspection protocols, either by manipulating computer systems that randomly selected containers for inspection, or by physically directing those containers to areas of the port where they would be loaded onto ships without examination. He knew which shipping companies operated with minimal oversight and might be used without triggering suspicion, either because company officials had been bribed or because the companies were so poorly managed that inserting contraband into their operations went unnoticed. The payment structure within Diouf's network was critical to maintaining operational security and aligning incentives among participants who might otherwise be tempted to cheat or inform on each other. Intermediaries who managed ground-level logistics, the individuals who arranged for boats to meet mother ships, who supervised the unloading of cocaine onto beaches, who drove trucks from landing sites to warehouses, who coordinated with customs officials, were often paid in kind with percentages of cocaine shipments rather than receiving cash payments. A boat captain who conducted a transfer might receive 5 kilograms of cocaine as payment for his role, giving him the option to sell those kilograms locally or to arrange his own export to a different market. This method served multiple purposes from the network's perspective. It reduced the financial trail that could be traced by investigators. No bank transfers, no cash deposits, no unusual wealth accumulation that might trigger tax investigations. It aligned incentives powerfully. If the shipment was seized by authorities, everyone in the chain lost their compensation, creating strong motivation for each participant to be careful and to watch for surveillance or compromise. It built loyalty through shared risk. Participants became complicit in the operation through possessing drugs, making them unlikely to cooperate with authorities. This payment method also created a secondary problem that emerged gradually but had profound consequences. As West African intermediaries accumulated cocaine as payment for their services, they needed to dispose of it somehow, and selling it locally became the easiest option. Cities across the region began experiencing surges in crack cocaine use as drugs that were meant to transit through the area instead remained and created local markets. What was designed as a pure transit corridor gradually became a destination market as well, with all the social problems and public health crises that cocaine epidemics bring. This transformation from transit to consumption zone created new vulnerabilities for trafficking networks. Local drug markets attracted local law enforcement attention and created user populations that might become informants. But by the time these consequences became apparent, the trade was too entrenched to reverse course. Diouf's specific role and the extent of his operations remain partially obscure, because much of the evidence comes from investigations that occurred after his network was disrupted, and from informants whose accounts may have been self-serving or inaccurate. What can be established is that he was part of an operation that successfully moved multi-ton quantities of cocaine from South America through West Africa to the United States over a period of years, that he had connections to Latin American suppliers who trusted him with valuable shipments, that he commanded respect or fear from local officials who cooperated with his operations, and that he understood the logistics of international cocaine trafficking sufficiently to coordinate complex operations across continents. The influx of West African-managed cocaine had a transformative effect on American wholesale markets that wasn't fully understood by law enforcement until years after the supply routes were firmly established. The cocaine arriving through this route didn't announce itself through distinctive purity levels, unique cutting agents, or different distribution methods. It simply appeared in wholesale markets, sold by brokers and distributors who had no obvious connection to West African networks, moving through American distribution channels that had been serving the market for decades. Traditional supply routes through Mexico had become increasingly problematic for wholesale buyers by the early 2000s. The violence of Mexican cartel wars created supply instability as routes were disrupted by law enforcement, rival cartels, or internal power struggles. Shipments might be seized, delayed, or never arrive as Mexican organizations dealt with their own operational challenges. Border enforcement was intensifying with new technology, increased personnel, and better intelligence sharing between U.S. and Mexican agencies. Wholesale buyers in American cities, the mid-level traffickers who purchased multi-kilogram or larger quantities and distributed them to smaller dealers, faced unpredictable availability and pressure from law enforcement who had become sophisticated at tracking Mexican supply chains. The West African route offered a compelling alternative: stable, high-volume supply that bypassed the violence-prone Mexican corridors entirely. Cocaine arriving through West African networks entered through commercial ports using containerized shipping, a very different pathway than the various land border crossing methods used for Mexican shipments. This meant law enforcement agencies monitoring the Mexico border missed it entirely. The cocaine arrived with different paper trails, different cover stories, different routes through the distribution chain. By providing reliable supply at competitive prices, the additional costs of the longer route were offset by lower loss rates and more efficient operations. These networks quietly displaced traditional Mexican-sourced suppliers in some urban markets. The focus on logistics rather than street-level distribution meant that West African traffickers maintained remarkably low profiles despite moving enormous quantities of drugs. They weren't involved in turf wars over retail corners or housing projects. They didn't engage in the public shootings and drive-bys that characterize retail drug markets. They delivered product to wholesale buyers through prearranged meetings, collected payment, and departed, functioning more like sales representatives for a business than like the stereotypical image of violent drug dealers. The cocaine then moved into existing American distribution networks built over decades of the drug trade, networks of Dominican, Puerto Rican, African American, and other ethnic organizations that handled the retail distribution in cities across the East Coast and other regions. This separation of functions created significant operational security. A street-level dealer arrested in Baltimore might not know his cocaine came from Senegal rather than Mexico. A mid-level distributor busted in New York might know his supplier had West African connections, but have no direct contact with the international network. The compartmentalization made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to work cases upward from street arrests to identify and prosecute the high-level figures managing the international supply chain. Federal authorities only began to understand the scale and significance of the West African route once international reports and intelligence from European partners highlighted the transformation of the region into a major trafficking hub. Individual cases might involve suspects with West African connections, but the systemic nature of the shift, the fact that a fundamentally new supply route had emerged and was quietly capturing significant market share, wasn't apparent until researchers and analysts connected the dots across multiple investigations and jurisdictions. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime released a groundbreaking report in December 2007 with the stark title "West Africa Under Attack," which explicitly identified the region as a hub for the global cocaine trade and warned that trafficking was threatening to destabilize already fragile governments. This report synthesized intelligence from multiple countries, brought together seizure data that individually hadn't seemed significant but collectively revealed a disturbing pattern, and presented evidence that West Africa had transitioned from a minor, peripheral element of the cocaine trade into a central logistical hub. The report marked a turning point in international awareness, transforming West African cocaine trafficking from a niche concern of regional security analysts into a priority for international drug enforcement agencies. The chronology of increasing transit volumes told a compelling story. Regional observers had first noted unusual increases in cocaine transit through West Africa around 2004, seeing indications in small seizures and intelligence reports that something was changing. The period from 2005 to 2008 saw this trend accelerate dramatically. 46 metric tons of cocaine were seized in or around West Africa during these years, a staggering increase from the minimal amounts seized in previous years. Seizures don't represent the total volume of trafficking, only the fraction that authorities successfully intercept. If historical seizure rates of perhaps 5 to 10% of total traffic held in West Africa, the 46 tons seized suggested that somewhere between 460 and 920 tons might have successfully transited through the region during this period, though such calculations remain highly speculative. Even taking the most conservative interpretation, the seizures demonstrated beyond doubt that West Africa had become a major component of the transatlantic cocaine trade. Dismantling the West African-US cocaine pipeline required a fundamental paradigm shift in how international law enforcement approached drug trafficking investigations. Traditional street-level drug enforcement methods, arresting dealers based on undercover buys, seizing relatively small quantities during traffic stops or warrant executions, prosecuting local distributors in state courts where they typically received modest sentences, were completely insufficient for disrupting a network that functioned as a sophisticated global logistics firm with operations spanning 3 continents. Multiple criminal organizations coordinating activities across cultural and linguistic boundaries, and financial flows involving offshore banking, shell companies, and complex money laundering schemes. Authorities realized gradually and through the accumulation of intelligence from multiple failed or partially successful investigations that they needed to fundamentally reorient their approach. They needed to target the high-level brokers and coordinators who managed the transatlantic journey rather than the low-level couriers, street dealers, and mid-level distributors who were easily replaceable. They needed to follow the money, tracking financial flows and asset accumulation, rather than just following the drugs themselves, because financial investigation could identify key figures even when direct evidence of drug trafficking was difficult to obtain. They needed to work internationally, building cases that could be prosecuted in U.S. federal courts even when the crimes occurred primarily in foreign countries, and the defendants were foreign nationals who had never set foot in the United States. This approach, sometimes called the forensics of capital in academic literature analyzing the intersection of finance and criminal activity, focused on financial intelligence and the movement of illicit proceeds through formal and informal banking systems. Investigators began tracking remittance flows, looking for patterns that suggested money laundering rather than legitimate family support, large transfers that didn't match the income profiles of supposed senders, patterns of many small transfers designed to avoid reporting thresholds, transfers that were immediately moved again rather than being used for stated purposes like school fees or medical expenses. They identified shell companies used for money laundering by analyzing corporate registration patterns, looking for companies with opaque ownership structures, minimal legitimate business activity, and financial flows inconsistent with their stated purposes. They mapped the banking relationships that allowed traffickers to integrate narco profits into formal financial systems, following the money through multiple jurisdictions to identify the beneficial owners of accounts and assets accumulated through drug trafficking. The goal shifted from simply arresting low-level participants to removing the logistical architects of the operation, the individuals whose specialized knowledge, relationships, and coordination abilities made the network function. A low-level courier caught with 10 kilograms of cocaine might be easily replaced within days. A coordinator like Diouf, who understood maritime logistics, maintained relationships with multiple criminal organizations, knew which officials could be bribed, and had proven his reliability through successful operations was essentially irreplaceable. Removing such a figure would force the organization to rebuild relationships, re-establish logistics protocols, and potentially find new routes, creating disruption that might last months or years rather than the days or weeks that replacing a courier would take. International cooperation became absolutely essential rather than optional or helpful. The United States government, working primarily through the Drug Enforcement Administration, but also involving the FBI, Coast Guard, and State Department, began investing significant resources in building the capacity of West African states to patrol their borders and interdict trafficking operations. This capacity building took many forms. It included funding for coastal surveillance infrastructure, radar systems that could track maritime traffic, communication networks that allowed coordination between patrol vessels and command centers, and facilities for housing and operating patrol craft. It involved training for customs officials on inspection techniques, document examination, and recognition of concealment methods, along with provision of basic equipment like computers, databases, and communication devices that many West African customs facilities lacked. It encompassed assistance with establishing financial intelligence units in countries that lacked institutional capacity to track suspicious financial transactions or investigate money laundering, including helping draft legislation, train analysts, and establish procedures for international cooperation. Intelligence sharing networks were painstakingly established between regional bodies like the Economic Community of West African States, which brought together West African governments for economic cooperation, but could be leveraged for security cooperation as well, and the African Union, the continent-wide organization that could facilitate information sharing across regions. Advanced technologies began to be deployed, though their availability varied dramatically by location and remained limited compared to what was available at major US or European ports. AI-driven cargo scanners that could examine container contents without physical inspection became available at some major ports. GPS tracking systems allowed authorities to follow specific containers or vehicles. Satellite surveillance provided another layer of monitoring, though the vast expanse of the Atlantic and African coastlines meant coverage remained incomplete. Targeted indictments in U.S. federal courts became a crucial tool for disrupting international trafficking networks. U.S. federal law allows prosecution of foreign nationals whose criminal activities affect U.S. territory or citizens, even when the crimes occurred primarily outside U.S. borders and the defendants never entered the country. By prosecuting key figures like those in Diouf's network through sealed indictments that could be served if the individual traveled to a country with an extradition treaty, or through requests for extradition from countries where defendants were located, U.S. authorities aimed to disrupt operational continuity of supply chains. The removal of a single high-level coordinator could destabilize an entire route by eliminating the relationships and institutional knowledge necessary to manage complex international operations, forcing traffickers to rebuild networks, re-establish corrupted relationships with officials, and redevelop logistics protocols, all processes that took time and created opportunities for further enforcement actions. The Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force Program and similar initiatives brought together federal, state, and local agencies along with international partners to coordinate investigations targeting entire networks rather than individual cases. This coordination allowed information to flow between investigations that might previously have proceeded independently, creating opportunities to connect evidence from different sources and build more comprehensive cases. Despite all these efforts, the resources invested, the coordination achieved, the sophisticated techniques employed, the structural conditions that enabled the trade in the first place remained largely unaddressed. Poverty in West Africa persisted, creating populations desperate for economic opportunities that legitimate employment couldn't provide. Institutional weakness in government agencies continued due to chronic underfunding that international assistance could supplement but not replace. The global demand for cocaine in United States and European markets showed no signs of diminishing, ensuring that enormous profits would continue to flow to anyone who could successfully move cocaine from production zones to consumer markets. These underlying realities meant that progress against the trade had to be measured in decades rather than years, with each victory understood as temporary and partial rather than permanent or complete. Enforcement actions created temporary disruptions in supply chains. Operations that were running smoothly for months or years would suddenly face seizures, arrests, and the loss of key personnel. But the economic incentives that drove new actors into these roles remained constant. When one coordinator was arrested, others emerged to fill the gap, learning from the mistakes of predecessors and adapting operations to be more secure. When one route became too heavily monitored, alternative routes through neighboring countries with similar vulnerabilities would be developed. The fundamental economic logic of the trade, high consumer demand driving high prices, which generated enormous profits sufficient to overcome substantial risks and costs, remained intact regardless of enforcement pressure. One of the most significant unintended consequences of using West Africa as a transit hub, and one that enforcement officials and policymakers failed to adequately anticipate, was that the region didn't remain purely a transit zone through which drugs passed on their way to consumer markets. As traffickers paid local intermediaries in cocaine rather than cash, for all the operational security reasons previously discussed, the drugs began accumulating in West African cities faster than they could be re-exported to final destinations. This created an inventory problem for individual traffickers. They needed to convert cocaine into money, and the easiest way to do that was to sell it locally rather than arranging complex export operations. Crack cocaine, which requires only minimal processing from powder cocaine, essentially just cooking the powder with baking soda and water, began appearing in urban centers across Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, and neighboring countries during the late 2000s. The drug's low cost relative to powder cocaine, and its intense but short-lived effects made it accessible to impoverished populations who had no prior history or culture of cocaine use. In many West African countries, drug problems had historically been limited to cannabis, caught in certain regions, and to a lesser extent heroin. The sudden introduction of crack cocaine created entirely new patterns of addiction and social disruption. Addiction rates climbed rapidly as crack cocaine spread through urban areas. Public health systems, already severely strained by inadequate funding, endemic diseases like malaria and HIV/AIDS, and shortages of trained medical personnel and basic medications, found themselves completely overwhelmed by drug addiction cases they had no capacity to treat. Treatment facilities for substance abuse essentially didn't exist in most West African countries. Mental health services were minimal to non-existent. The medical understanding of addiction and evidence-based treatment approaches had little presence in African medical training or practice. Users who wanted help had nowhere to go, and users who were forced into contact with health systems through medical emergencies or police encounters received inadequate care that did little to address underlying addiction. The social effects of this sudden cocaine epidemic cascaded through communities in ways that compounded pre-existing challenges. Families dealing with addicted members lost income as users became unable to work regularly or spent their earnings on drugs rather than family needs. The caretaking burden fell disproportionately on women, who found themselves supporting addicted husbands, sons, or other relatives while managing household responsibilities and often holding jobs in the informal economy to generate needed income. Crime rates increased predictably as users sought money to feed their habits through theft, robbery, or involvement in low-level drug distribution that paid in product. Young people who might have pursued education instead became involved in the drug trade, either as users themselves or as low-level distributors earning money or product through sales. The opportunity cost was enormous. Youth who could have acquired skills and entered legitimate employment instead found themselves trapped in criminal enterprises with no exit strategy. Traditional social structures that had historically provided cohesion, support, and regulation of behavior, religious organizations including Muslim brotherhoods and Christian churches, extended family networks, traditional leadership structures, found themselves unable to compete with the overwhelming financial power of narco-capital. Religious leaders who might have provided moral authority against drug use couldn't offer economic alternatives that matched the income available from distribution. Extended families who might have supported struggling members couldn't cope with multiple cases of addiction simultaneously. Traditional authorities whose social power rested on community consensus found that consensus breaking down as economic desperation drove behavior that violated traditional norms. The insidious effects of local consumption compounded the institutional decay caused by corruption and state capture, creating a feedback loop that became increasingly difficult to break with each passing year. Corruption allowed trafficking to flourish. Trafficking created local drug markets. Local drug markets created addiction and crime. Addiction and crime further destabilized communities and institutions. And that destabilization made communities and institutions even more vulnerable to criminal penetration. Breaking this cycle required simultaneously addressing corruption, drug trafficking, addiction treatment, economic development, and institutional strengthening. A combination of interventions that no single agency or program could possibly deliver, and that required sustained political will over decades that few governments could maintain. This transformation from transit to consumption zone wasn't confined to the immediate transit hubs, but spread through entire regions as drugs distributed to markets hundreds of kilometers from major ports. The problem became structural rather than localized, not just a Dakar problem or a Lagos problem, but a West African regional problem that required coordinated responses across countries with very different governance capacities and political priorities. This wasn't a temporary problem created by a single supply chain that would disappear once that chain was disrupted. It was a fundamental shift in West African society created by the exposure to cocaine during the transit boom. Once a local drug market is established, with users who have developed dependencies, distribution networks that have learned how to function, and social tolerance for drug use that has developed, that market becomes self-sustaining. Even if the transatlantic trafficking routes were completely shut down tomorrow, an impossibility but a useful hypothetical, the demand for cocaine would persist among the addicted population. That persistent demand would create economic incentives for new supply networks to emerge, either through domestic production of alternative drugs, continued smuggling at smaller scales, or diversion from wherever cocaine could be obtained. The West African route, intended as a temporary tactical adaptation to enforcement pressure in traditional trafficking corridors, had inadvertently created a permanent transformation in West African societies that will require generations to fully address.